Part 2. Against the overwhelming numbers of the Mohawk, the handful of hunters had little real chance. But the reckoning was to be decided from another quarter. Through the well of pain that raced through its body, the rage of the stricken mammoth fought its way to overwhelm the beast's mind. Sharpening its fury, the huge beast spun around, the sudden motion throwing the last savage of the howdah. The black eyes of the mammoth glared in berserk fury at the little men fighting around it, lost in a red madness that did not differentiate between savage and Mohawk. The mammoth struck, smashing men beneath its ponderous feet, goring them with its blunted tusks. Dorgo watched the serpent-like trunk lurch upwards, a struggling savage trapped in its coils. The mammoth tightened its hold, breaking the man's body in a spray of blood and ruptured organs. The tattered wreckage dripped back to the earth, and the root reared back, bellowing as it plunged deeper into its rampage. Dorgo grabbed the great iron spike resting beside him in his ivory cage. It was a tool every mammoth master, as vital as the rune-covered goad, but it was one that no savage ever wanted to use. Dorgo hesitated, but then saw the broken remains of a hunter ground into paste beneath the mammoth's pounding feet. Snarling, he set the spike against the back of the mammoth's skull. With a roar as feral as the one of a raging beast, he forced the spike through the scaly plates and the thick skull beneath. The mammoth reared one final time as the spike impaled its brain. Strength deserted the beast's body in an instant. Dorgo clutched the bars of his cage, bracing himself as the mammoth toppled to the earth. The impact snapped the leather straps that bound the cage to neck, and Dorgo was thrown across the plain to crash against the rocky slope of the hill. The ivory cage crumpled under the impact, sending painful slivers scything through the savage's body. He felt one ivory talon rip into his thigh, another punch through his forearm. Racking pain shot through his body, every nerve on fire. He tried to move, ignoring the desperate plea of his body to stay still. His arm was caught, transfixed upon the broken ivory bar. Biting down the pain, Dorgo drew his iron knife and began to saw away at the wreckage. As he worked, Dorgo could see the Mohawk descending from the slopes in force. They capered around the falling mammoth, swatting at it with their clubs, stabbing it with their spears. Gleefully, the Kurgan warriors brained the injured savage hunters, smashing their skulls with their clubs. Among the celebrating Mohawk was a hulking brute, his body so swollen with muscle that he more resembled an ogre than a man. The head that rose up was from his thick tree-stump neck bore the same flesh mask as the other Mohawk, but it was been cut away to allow the man's jaw to protrude forward and his dagger-like teeth to jut from its shriveled lip. A lattice work of scars and cuts adorned the warrior's body, where it stood exposed by his crude hide armor. In his paw-like hands he carried an immense mattock, the head of a hammer displaying a riot of blood-crusted spikes. This, Dorgo knew, was no mere champion of the Mohawk, but no less than Tsar Locke, chieftain of the entire tribe. Locke prowled among the dead savage, lifting them from the bloody ground to stare into the face of each corpse. One and all he tossed them aside with callous contempt, stomping onto the next body with ever-increasing ire. A particularly mangled savage, the face ruptured to pulp, provoked the Tsar's already fragile temper. He turned upon the nearest of his warriors, with a howl of fury, smashing the Mohawk with his deadly hammer. The Kurgan's chest cracked like an eggshell, pitching him to the earth in a shrieking heap. Locke gave the murdered warrior no further thought, stalking ahead to the bulk of the mammoth and the ruined howdah on its back. A grim realization came upon Dorgo. Locke was looking for someone among the dead, and there was only one person that could be. The Mohawk seldom ventured into the crumbling hills. Their own hunting grounds were far to the west. It had not been chance that had caused them to ambush the savage. The Kurgan had carefully planned their attack. The way Locke picked his way among the dead, Dorgo was sure he knew who had led the hunting party. Killing Hutka's son would avenge the death of the Tsar's son, who had been slain in a raid against the savage several months before. Dorgo redoubled his efforts to saw through the cage. To fall into the Tsar's hands dead would be a wretched enough, but to do so alive. The hulking Tsar moved away from the ruined howdah, roaring in disgusted frustration. Then his eyes caught a gleam of ivory against the slope, and the shudder of frantic motion within. A cruel smile spread across Locke's face. A smile of long denied vengeance. He barked orders to his warriors, and they began to converge on the wreckage. Dorgo could hear the hide boots of the Mohawk scraping against the rocky slope as they climbed to reach him. The iron knife continued to chew away at the ivory bar that pinned him to the cage. Grinding his teeth against the agony, the savage looked around the wreckage for his sword, but the weapon had been thrown clear when the cage slammed into the slope. He stared at the small knife, with no illusions about its potency against the clubs of the Mohawk or Locke's mattock. The hammer was a gruesome relic from the time of Teocte, a demon weapon forged by the king and gifted to the ancient Tsar of the Mohawk. One blow from the weapon was enough to fold iron, as though it were cloth. Dorgo had already seen a graphic display of its power against flesh and bone. Suddenly the Mohawk advance faltered. A sharp cry went up from the plain below, silenced in a liquid gurgle. The struggling warriors spun around in alarm, their powerful bodies coiling for action. Even Locke turned away, the Tsar's fist tightening round the haft of his demon hammer. Below, Dorgo could see a lone warrior striding towards the Mohawk, his body encased in crimson armor, chased with bronze, his head enclosed within a skull-like helm. A blade of darkness filled the stranger's hand, smoke rising from its hungry edge. At his feet sprawled the cleft debris of a Mohawk, who had lingered near the mammoth, more eager for loot than helping Locke claim his revenge. The armored warrior marched heedlessly through the spreading pool of gore, his skull-faced visage fixed upon the slope of the hill. Other Mohawk scavengers backed away from the apparition, dropping their plunder of ivory and bronze. Their frightened mutters drifted up to Dorgo and the Kurgan around him. It was the fear displayed by the warriors more than the sight of his butchered men that enraged Locke. Spitting with fury, he roared at the Mohawk below, ordering them to kill the stranger. He punctuated his command with a menacing slap of his mattock against the ground, overcoming the trepidation of his warriors with their greater fear of him. 5 Mohawk took up the clubs and axes stolen from the slain savage. They began to circle the stranger like a pack of slinking wolves stalking a lion. The skull-faced helm never turned. The attention of the man within focused upon the slope. There was a sense of disdain in his manner as he marched steadily onwards. Ignoring the menacing men who had surrounded him, the Mohawk sprang at the armored warrior with a savage cry. In a blur of motion, the stranger spun to face them. The strange black sword bit through the arm of the first Mohawk, snapping it like a twig, and throwing him back in a spray of blood and screams. A second Mohawk, leaping at him from the left, caught the point of the sword in his chest. Still in motion, the stranger ripped free his weapon, chewing through the rib and lung at the edge erupted from the man's side. The third Mohawk came at him from behind. He flopped to the ground as the black sword chopped through both legs, as though they were brittle desert brambles. The fourth, striking from the right, caught the tip of the blade slashing through his face. He fell clutching at the broth of blood and brain drooling from his ruptured eyes. The brutal assault was over almost before it had begun. The Mohawk were accomplished ambushers, skilled as jackals at the art of coordinated attack, but their prey had been faster still. Killing 4 of their number, while the echo of the war cry was still wailing across the plain. The last scavenger faltered in his attack, staring with open-mouthed horror at the havoc the stranger had visited in the blink of an eye. Blood erupted from the man's mouth as the black sword slammed through his gut. The stranger ignored the scarlet that splattered against his armor and the dying hands that clutched at a heavy fur cloak he wore. Callously, he ripped his trap blade upwards, crunching through bone and flesh until the black sword tore free. Slashed from stomach to shoulder, the Mohawk slumped to the ground. Something like terror crawled into Locke's beady eyes, behind their mask of flayed flesh. The Tsar shouted at his warriors, fear lending a new note of rage to his voice. The Mohawk hesitated, staring uncertainly at one another, no man eager to fight, to be the first to confront this strange and terrible foe. Locke's mattock lashed out, pulverizing the skull of the Kurgan closest to him, dropping him in a burst of blood and bone. The example was enough. The Tsar's tyranny reasserted. 20 Mohawk marauders, swollen bulks of muscle and rage, charged down the slope, their murderous cudgels lifted overhead in savage display. To Dorgo's eyes, what followed was slaughter, not battle. 20 warriors converged on one. When the carnage abated, when the screams had faded into death rattles, when the sound of flesh and bone being torn asunder ebbed, it was one who stood triumphant. The havoc of his black blade lay strewn and dying around the armored killer. Gore dripped from the stranger, coating his crimson armor in a sanguine cloak. But none of it was his. 20 men had faced him, but not one had landed a blow against their foe. Their killer turned his head, stuttering the butchery he had turned. Then he turned his skull helm once more to the slope, where the ashen-faced Locke waited. The Mohawk Tsar watched the warrior march through the wreckage of his warband, every step causing his eyes to bulge wider with fear. Locke cast a gaze from side to side, but the strength of his followers had been spent. There were no fresh Kurgan to throw at the gore-drenched specter. The Tsar spat into the dust, trying to let his fury overwhelm his fear. "You still tempt the gods, eh, pig?" Locke snarled, brandishing his mattock. "You kill those dogs so you think you can fight Locke?" He brought his hammer crashing down, exploding a rock into pebbly splinters. The armored killer's approach did not falter, the man within the crimson plates unimpressed by the Tsar's bravado. The air of arrogance goaded Locke's fury. As surely as the ivory hook Gorgo had used on the mammoth, the Mohawk's chieftain's jutting jaw dropped open in a howl of rage, his immense bulk hurling down the slope at his adversary. The armored killer paused, waiting to meet the Tsar's charge. The black sword licked out like a tongue of a dragon, flashing through the chieftain's belly, spilling it onto the ground. At the same time, the mattock crashed into the nameless warrior, smashing him like a titan's fist. The demonic weapon kicked him back, throwing him through the air. The armored warrior smashed into the stiffening hulk of the slain mammoth, falling headfirst into a stream of filth oozing from its wound. Locke wilted to his knees, the mattock sliding from his hands that were desperately fumbling at his ghastly wound. The Tsar struggled to press the wound close, to staunch the seepage of blood and bile. In the fashion of a dying wolf, he refused to accept the gravity of his wound, refusing to concede the approach of death. But even in his agony, a smile split the Mohawk's brutal face. At least his enemy would follow him into the hunting halls.